In the harsh New Mexico territory of 1879, a war-weary cowboy named Jedediah Hart lived alone on his small ranch, speaking only to his dog and the cattle that wandered his modest land. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, his heart hardened by memories of battles he'd rather forget. Every evening, he'd sit by his window, watching the sun disappear behind the canyon walls, wondering if he'd spend the rest of his days in silence. Then one bitter winter night changed everything. Near the frozen creek that marked the edge of his property, he found her, a young woman named Lark, collapsed and trembling, clutching nothing but stale bread and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might show her mercy. She had no family, no shelter, no future, except the kindness of a stranger. What happened next would transform two broken souls into something beautiful. But would their newfound love survive when the law came, knocking at their door? The morning ritual never changed. Jedediah Hart rose before dawn, pulled on his worn boots, and stepped into the crisp New Mexico air that bit at his weathered face like an old friend's honest words. The silence that greeted him each day was both comfort and curse, a reminder of the peace he'd found in this remote corner of the territory, and the loneliness that had settled into his bones like winter cold. Rex, his faithful border collie, stretched and yawned beside the cabin door, tail wagging with the reliable enthusiasm that Jed sometimes envied. At least the dog still found joy in simple things. Jed scratched behind the animal's ears, feeling the familiar weight of another day ahead. "Come on, boy. Cattle won't tend themselves." His voice sounded strange in the morning stillness, rougher than he remembered from the days when he'd had reason to use it regularly. That was 7 years ago now, when he'd first arrived in Socorro County with nothing but a horse, a dog, and memories he'd rather forget. The war had ended, but the ghosts of fallen comrades still visited him in dreams, their faces as clear as the day they'd drawn their last breath. The ranch, if you could call his modest spread that, consisted of 40 acres of scrubland bordered by red canyon walls and a seasonal creek that ran year-round thanks to the mountain snowmelt. He'd built the cabin himself, nothing fancy, just sturdy pine logs chinked with adobe mud, a stone fireplace that drew well, and 2 rooms that felt enormous after years of sleeping in army tents. His cattle, a small herd of 30 head, were hardy beasts that thrived on the sparse grass and sage. They knew him, trusted him in the way animals trusted those who cared for them without sentimentality. He provided what they needed. They provided what he needed. It was an honest arrangement, as he walked toward the barn, his boots crunching through the frost that painted the ground silver. Jed caught his reflection in the water trough. The face that stared back showed all 38 years of his life, maybe more. Gray had crept into his brown hair and beard, lines mapped the corners of his eyes, and a scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, a souvenir from Gettysburg. That ached when storms approached. Inside the barn, he kept his most treasured possessions, letters he'd written but never sent. They filled a wooden crate beside his workbench, hundreds of pages addressed to men who would never read them. Letters to Samuel Morrison, who died saving a wounded Confederate boy. Letters to Thomas Kelly, who'd taken a bullet meant for Jed. Letters to Captain William Hayes, who'd led their unit with a kind of quiet courage Jed had tried to emulate ever since. He pulled out his latest attempt, written the night before by lamplight. "Dear Captain Hayes, winter's coming hard this year. The cattle are doing well, though. Rex is getting gray around the muzzle. Sometimes I wonder what you'd make of this life I've built. It's peaceful mostly, quiet in ways the war never was. But peaceful and empty aren't the same thing, are they?" The letter ended there, as they all did, with questions he couldn't answer and feelings he couldn't quite name. He folded it carefully and placed it with the others. The morning chores took 2 hours, feeding the cattle, checking the fence lines, hauling water from the well. Rex bounded alongside him, chasing rabbits that materialized from the sagebrush like brown ghosts. The dog's joy was infectious, and Jed found himself almost smiling as Rex's ears perked at every sound. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun had cleared the canyon rim, painting the landscape in shades of gold and red that never failed to stir something in his chest. This was why he'd stayed, why he'd chosen this hard life over the easier prospects that awaited him in town. The land spoke to him in ways that people no longer could. The town of Socorro lay 15 miles south, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts that served the scattered ranchers and miners who called this corner of the territory home. Jed made the journey once a month for supplies, enduring the well-meaning attempts at conversation from folks who couldn't understand why a man would choose solitude over society. Martha Gonzalez, who ran the general store with her husband, always asked if he'd found himself a wife yet. Sheriff Benjamin Cole made jokes about hermits and offered to introduce him to available women. Even Father Miguel, the Catholic priest who befriended him despite Yet's irregular church attendance, gently suggested that God hadn't meant for man to live alone. They meant well, these people, but they didn't understand. The war had burned something out of him, some essential part that made connection possible. He'd tried, in those first years after Appomattox, to find his place among civilians again, but their concerns seemed trivial compared to the weight of what he'd seen, what he'd done, what he'd failed to do. So he'd headed west, as broken men had been doing since the continent was mapped, seeking space enough to contain their pain. He'd found it here, in this high desert country where a man could go days without seeing another soul, where the only sounds were wind through the canyons and the distant call of hawks riding the owl. Thermals. The cabin's interior reflected his practical nature. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by shelves that held his few books, mostly works on animal husbandry, and a worn copy of Walt Whitman's poetry that had somehow survived the war. His bed occupied one corner, a simple frame he'd built himself with a mattress, stuffed with straw and covered by wool blankets his mother had sent from Ohio before she'd passed. The kitchen consisted of a cast-iron stove, a wooden table scarred by years of use, and cabinets that held basic provisions: beans, flour, coffee, salt pork, and canned goods from his monthly town trips. He cooked simple meals that filled his belly without bringing pleasure, eating by lamplight while Rex dozed. By the fire, evenings were the hardest. That's when the silence grew heavy, when memories had room to breathe and expand. He'd taken to reading aloud to Rex, partly for the sound of a human voice, and partly because the dog seemed to enjoy it. Whitman's words carried particular weight. In the desert stillness, I celebrate myself, and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. The poet's optimism felt foreign now, but Jed read on anyway, hoping that someday the words might mean something again. As winter deepened, his world contracted further. The cattle stayed closer to the barn, huddling against the wind that howled down from the mountains. Snow dusted the canyon rims and lingered in shadows where the sun couldn't reach. On the coldest nights, he brought Rex inside, grateful for the company even if it came with 4 legs and a wet-nosed. It was during one such evening, with sleet tapping against the windows like skeletal fingers, that Jed made a decision that would change everything. He was writing another letter, this one to his brother back in Ohio, when Rex suddenly raised his head and growled low in his throat. "What is it, boy?" The dog padded to the door, hackles raised, listening to something Jed couldn't hear. Outside, the storm raged with unusual fury, but beneath the wind's howl came another sound, faint, almost human. Jed pulled on his coat and boots, grabbed a lantern, and stepped into the night. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and the wind nearly knocked him off his feet. Rex pressed close to his legs, both of them fighting their way toward the creek that marked his property's eastern boundary. That's where they found her. She lay beside the water, so still that Yet's first thought was that they'd discovered a frozen corpse. But as his lantern light fell across her face, he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest, the flutter of eyelids that suggested dreams or delirium. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair that had escaped from what might once have been a neat bun. Her dress was torn and mud-stained, her feet bare and bleeding. In her arms she clutched a small bundle wrapped in cloth bread, he realized, so stale it had turned to stone. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Jed stood, frozen by indecision. Getting involved meant complications, questions, responsibilities he'd spent 7 years avoiding. His life was simple because he'd made it simple, because he'd learned that caring for others led only to loss and grief. But as he watched her shiver, in the bitter cold, something stirred in his chest, not the love he'd thought dead, but something quieter and more fundamental. Compassion, maybe, or simple human decency. The recognition that no living creature should suffer alone in the darkness. He knelt beside her, and her eyes fluttered open. They were brown. He saw the color of rich earth after rain. Fear flickered in their depths, followed by something that might have been hope. "Don't send me back," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please, don't send me back." Jed looked into those desperate eyes and felt the careful walls he'd built around his heart crack just a little. He didn't know who she was or where she'd come from, didn't know what she was running from, or what trouble she might bring to his quiet life. But he knew he couldn't leave her there to die. The woman weighed almost nothing in Yet's arms, a bundle of bones and threadbare fabric that spoke of weeks, maybe months, of hardship. As he carried her toward the cabin, Rex trotting anxiously beside them, her head lolled against his shoulder, and he caught the faint scent of lavender soap beneath the dirt and desperation. Someone, somewhere, had cared enough to give her that small luxury. Inside the warm cabin, Jed faced his first dilemma. His bed was the only proper place to lay her. But 7 years of solitary living had left him unpracticed in the protocols of propriety. He settled for placing her on the wooden bench near the fireplace, close enough to the heat, but far enough from impropriety to satisfy his conscience. She stirred as he built up the fire, her eyelids fluttering like moth wings against candlelight. The torn dress once, a respectable brown wool, he could see now hung loose on her thin frame. Her stockings were in tatters, her bare feet cut and swollen from walking on rocky ground. The bread she'd clutched so desperately lay on the floor where it had fallen, and Jed saw that it was indeed stale enough to break teeth. "Water," she whispered, the word cracked and desperate. He brought her a cup, supporting her head as she drank, with the careful greed of someone who'd known real thirst. When she'd had enough, she sank back against the bench, studying his face with those earth-brown eyes. "You're real," she said, as if she'd been dreaming so long she'd forgotten the difference. "Real enough." Jed pulled a chair closer, keeping distance between them, but staying near enough to help if she needed it. "What's your name, Lark?" The answer came without hesitation, but something in her eyes suggested it might not be the whole truth. Lark ... Meadows. The pause before the surname told him everything he needed to know about her circumstances. She was running from something. Someone, and whatever name she'd been born with was now a liability. "Well, Miss Meadows," he said, playing along with the fiction, because everyone deserved the dignity of their chosen identity. "I'm Jedediah Hart. This is my place." She tried to sit up straighter, wincing as her body protested. "I don't have any money to pay you. I can work, though. I'm good with animals, and I can cook, clean, mend clothes. We'll worry about that when you're strong enough to stand without." Swaying, he stood and moved to the kitchen area, pulling down a can of beef broth from his meager supplies. "When did you last eat something that wasn't hard as stone?" The question seemed to confuse her, as if the concept of regular meals had become foreign. "Days, maybe a week. I had some cheese, but it went bad in the heat." As Jed heated the broth, he found himself stealing glances at her. Even in her current state, there was something compelling about Lark Meadows, not just her physical appearance, though she was certainly pretty beneath the dirt and exhaustion, but something in her bearing. She held herself with a dignity that poverty and desperation hadn't managed to break. "The storm," she said suddenly. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough. Should blow itself out by morning, but you won't be traveling anywhere for days regardless, not in your condition." She tensed at this, and he saw fear flicker across her features. "I can't stay. I have to keep moving." "Moving toward what?" "There's nothing east of here but 50 miles of desert, and a railroad stop that sees 1 train a week. West gets you into Apache country, and they're not feeling hospitable these days. North is all mountains and snow. South ... he shrugged. South gets you to Socorro eventually, but that's still a hard day's ride for someone on horseback and healthy. The geography lesson seemed to deflate her, and she sank back against the bench. I thought ... the map made it look closer. What map? She reached into the folds of her torn dress and produced a crumpled piece of paper, hand-drawn and barely legible. Jed studied it by lamplight and recognized the optimistic cartography of someone who'd never actually traveled the distances they were depicting. Who drew this for you? A woman in Kansas City. She said her brother had come west and found work in the silver mines. Said it was only a few days' walk from the railroad. Jed handed the map back, trying to keep pity out of his expression. Her brother probably took the stage, not walked. And the mines are another 100 miles west of here, up in the mountains. The news hit her like a physical blow. She closed her eyes, and he saw tears leak from beneath her lashes. I've been walking for 3 weeks, she whispered. 3 weeks, and I'm not even halfway. The broth was ready, and he poured it into a bowl, adding some crackers he'd softened in the liquid. When he offered it to her, her hands shook so badly. She could barely hold the spoon. Here. He guided her hands, helping her bring the first taste to her lips. The simple kindness seemed to undo her completely, and she began to cry in earnest, not the delicate weeping of parlor manners, but the raw, ugly sobbing of someone who'd held too much inside for too long. Jed sat quietly while she wept, occasionally, offering her more broth when the crying subsided enough for her to swallow. Rex patted over and rested his head on her knee, offering his own simple comfort. I'm sorry, she finally managed. I don't usually fall apart like this. You've got cause, he said simply. Takes strength to cry sometimes. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the dirt on her cheeks. You must think I'm a fool, trying to walk across the territory with nothing but stale bread and a hand-drawn map. I think you're someone who got desperate enough to try something dangerous. The question is, what made you that desperate? They... Shudders came down over her expression immediately, and she focused on the bowl in her hands. Some things are better left buried. Jed recognized the look. He'd worn it himself often enough. Fair enough. Everyone's got a right to their privacy. They sat in comfortable silence while she finished the broth. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, and the storm outside began to lose some of its fury. Rex had settled himself at Lark's feet, apparently deciding she belonged to his pack now. I'll take the floor tonight, Jed said when she'd eaten what she could. You need proper rest. I can't take your bed. You can and you will. I've slept on worse than a good wooden floor. She started to protest again, but exhaustion was winning the battle against propriety. Her eyelids were drooping, and she swayed, even sitting down. Miss Meadows' Lark, he corrected himself. When someone offers you help, it's not charity. It's just one human being doing right by another. You'd do the same if our positions were reversed. You don't know that. Yes, I do. He stood and began pulling blankets from a chest in the corner. Anyone who's walked 3 weeks through hostile country rather than give up on hope, who clutches stale bread like it's precious, because it might be the difference between living and dying, that person has the kind of backbone that helps others when they can. She watched him arrange the blankets on the floor near the fire. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I could be a thief, a murderer, a could-be he. Greed. But you're not. Thieves and murderers don't say, don't send me back when they're caught. They say, you can't prove anything, or I'll kill you if you try. You said please. The simple observation seemed to surprise her. She studied his face as if trying to solve a puzzle. You're not what I expected to find out here. What did you expect? Hard men, dangerous men, the kind who'd take advantage of a woman alone. Jed felt something cold settle in his stomach. Is that what you were running from? Someone who took advantage? The question hung in the air, like smoke from a dying fire. Lark's hands tightened on the empty bowl, her knuckles white with strain. I was employed by a family in St. Louis, she said finally, each word carefully chosen. The Harrisons. I was supposed to be a governess for their children, but She trailed off, staring into the fire. Jed waited, understanding that some stories had to be told in their own time. Mr. Harrison was a deacon in the church, she continued. Very respectable. Mrs. Harrison was involved in all the right charity organizations. From the outside, they looked like pillars of the community. But from the inside? From the inside, he was a man who thought his money gave him the right to anything he wanted. And she was a woman who'd rather blame the help than admit what kind of man she'd married. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Jed had seen enough of the world to understand what she wasn't saying directly. You tried to leave. I tried to leave many times. But they kept my wages, said I owed them for room and board. For the clothes they provided. Every time I saved enough for train fare, there'd be some new expense charged against my account. Some broken dish I'd supposedly damaged, some task I'd supposedly done poorly. So you took what you were owed. She met his eyes directly for the first time, and he saw steel beneath the vulnerability. I took my wages for 6 months' work. Nothing more. But they'll call it theft because it's easier than admitting why I really left. The storm outside was dying down, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had grown heavy with shared understanding. Jed recognized the weight she carried, not just the physical exhaustion of her journey, but the deeper burden of being in the right, while the world insisted she was wrong. They'll be looking for you, he said. Maybe. Probably. Mr. Harrison has connections in law enforcement. Friends who owe him favors. Then you can't keep running west. You need to disappear for a while. Let the trail go cold. I can't ask you to harbor a fugitive. You're not asking. I'm offering. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. This is good country for disappearing. Folks mind their own business, and there's plenty of space to get lost in. She stared at him as if he'd offered to lasso the moon. You'd risk that? For a stranger? Jed looked at her sitting there in his firelight, broken, but not beaten, afraid, but not defeated. Something in his chest, dormant for 7 years, stirred like an ember finding fresh air. Miss Lark Meadows, he said quietly, I don't think you're a stranger anymore. Morning came with the peculiar silence that follows a storm, as if the world was holding its breath to see what damage had been done. Jed woke on the floor near the dying embers of the fire, his back stiff from the hard wood, but his sleep surprisingly peaceful. For the first time in years, he hadn't dreamed of the war. Lark was still asleep in his bed, curled on her side, with one hand tucked under her cheek like a child. In the gray dawn light filtering through the cabin's single window, he could see that she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 22 or 23. The dirt had been washed away by her tears the night before, revealing a heart-shaped face dusted with freckles across her nose. Rex lay on the floor beside the bed, having apparently appointed himself her guardian during the night. The dog's tail thumped once when he saw Jed awake, but he didn't move from his post. Traitor, Jed murmured fondly, pulling on his boots as quietly as possible. The morning chores couldn't wait, regardless of guests or complications. The cattle needed hay, the ice on their water trough needed breaking, and there were fence posts to check after the storm. But as he stepped outside into the crystalline air, Jed found himself moving more quietly than usual, reluctant to wake the woman sleeping in his bed. The storm had left behind a world transformed. Snow dusted the canyon rims like powdered sugar, and ice turned every puddle into a mirror that reflected the pale sky. His breath came in white puffs as he made his way to the barn, where his small herd had taken shelter during the worst of the weather. The cattle greeted him with their usual mixture of expectation and mild annoyance. They were hardy beasts bred for this harsh country, but they knew the difference between adequate care and exceptional care. This morning, perhaps influenced by the presence of another soul to care for, Jed found himself being more generous with the hay than strictly necessary. Getting soft in your old age, he told himself, but without much conviction. As he worked, his mind kept drifting back to the cabin and its unexpected occupant. In 7 years of solitude, he'd grown accustomed to the rhythms of his own company, the predictable cycle of work and rest and quiet contemplation. The presence of another person, especially a woman, disrupted that rhythm in ways both unsettling and oddly pleasant. He'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone to consider beyond Himself and Rex, the simple act of moving quietly to avoid waking her, of checking twice to make sure the fire would keep burning while he was outside, reminded him of aspects of himself that had been dormant for too long. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun had cleared the eastern canyon wall and filled the interior with golden light. Lark was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with her feet tucked under her torn dress, watching the door with the alert stillness of someone accustomed to being ready to run. "Morning," he said, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks." She smoothed her hair back from her face, a gesture that was probably habit, but struck him as endearingly self-conscious. "I hope you weren't too uncomfortable on the floor. I'd slept worse places." He moved to the stove and began building up the fire for breakfast. "You hungry?" "Starving, but I don't want to eat your food without earning it somehow." Jed paused in his work, studying her face. The fear from the night before had receded, replaced by a determined dignity that he recognized and respected. She wasn't looking for charity. She was looking for a way to maintain her self-worth while accepting help. "Well," he said slowly, "I was planning to mend some harness this morning. Work goes faster with 2 pairs of hands, if you're interested." Relief flickered across her features. "I'm very good with leather work. My father was a cobbler before. He died. He taught me to use an awl and thread before I learned to embroider. Then you're hired." He pulled eggs and bacon from his supplies, noting mentally that he'd need to make a trip to town sooner than planned. "Payment is room and board until you're strong enough to travel. Fair?" "More than fair." They settled into an easy routine over breakfast, the conversation flowing more naturally than Jed would have expected. She asked about the ranch, the cattle, the challenges of living so far from town. He found himself talking more than he had in months, describing the seasonal rhythms of the land, the personality quirks of individual animals, the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. "You love it here," she observed, watching his face as he spoke. "Wasn't sure I was capable of loving anything anymore," he admitted, then paused, surprised by his own honesty. "But yes, I suppose I do. What did you do before this?" "Before you came west?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Jed felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever the conversation approached his past. "I was a soldier," he said simply. "The war ended badly for me. Figured it was time for a change of scenery." She nodded as if she understood the weight of things left unsaid. Sometimes starting over is the only way to keep breathing. After breakfast, they moved to the barn where Yet's leather work waited. The harness had been damaged when one of his horses spooked during a thunderstorm the month before, and he'd been putting off the tedious work of repair. But with Lark's help, the task transformed from drudgery into something approaching pleasure. Her hands were small, but sure as she guided the heavy needle through the leather, her stitches even and strong. They worked mostly in comfortable silence, broken by occasional questions about technique or observations about the weather. Rex divided his attention between them, clearly torn between his loyalty to Jed and his fascination with their guest. "He's a good dog," Lark said, pausing to scratch behind Rex's ears. "How long have you had him?" "Since he was a pup. Found him half-starved on the side of the road about 6 years ago. Someone had dumped him, I guess. Figured he wasn't worth the trouble." "There? Loss." She returned to her stitching, but Jed caught the small smile that curved her lips. "He's beautiful. Those eyes, it's like he understands everything you say. Sometimes I think he understands better than most people." Jed tested the tension. "On a repaired strap. He's the best company I've ever had. Present company accepted, of course." The compliment brought color to her cheeks, and she ducked her head to hide her pleased expression. It occurred to Jed that she probably hadn't received many genuine compliments in recent years, and the thought stirred something protective in his chest knot as they worked. He found himself stealing glances at her profile, noting the concentration that furrowed her brow, the way she bit her lower lip when wrestling with a particularly difficult stitch. There was grace in her movements, despite the rough clothing and work-worn hands, a natural elegance that spoke of better times and careful upbringing. "You weren't always a governess," he said. It wasn't quite a question. No. She paused in her work, considering how much to reveal. My parents had a small shop in Illinois. Nothing grand, but we were comfortable. When they died in the influenza outbreak 3 years ago, I had to sell everything to pay their debts. The governess position was supposed to be a fresh start. But it wasn't. It was a trap dressed up as an opportunity. Her voice carried a bitter edge that spoke of hard-learned lessons. I should have known better when they offered to pay my travel expenses. Generous employers usually have generous reasons. They finished the harness repair as the sun reached its midday peak, the leather supple and strong under their combined efforts. Jed was pleased with the work, but more pleased with the easy partnership that had developed between them. They moved well together, anticipating each other's needs without constant communication. "You're handy to have around," he said as they cleaned up the tools. Most folks would have tried to rush that job, made a mess of it. My father always said good work was its own reward. She folded the leather scraps neatly, her movements economical and precise. "He'd have liked you, I think. He believed in the value of quiet competence." Sounds like a wise man. He was. Too honest for his own good, maybe, but wise. She paused, her hands stilling on the workbench. "He used to say that character was what you did when no one was watching. You have good character, Mr. Hart." The observation caught him off guard. He wasn't accustomed to being seen, really seen, by another person. In town, he was the hermit cowboy, a figure more of curiosity than genuine interest. But Lark looked at him with clear eyes that seemed to see past the surface to something deeper. "Jed," he said. "Just Jed. Jed." She smiled, and he felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening after being locked for too long. "Thank you for letting me stay, for not asking too many questions. Everyone deserves a chance to catch their breath," he said. "Besides, Rex likes you. That's recommendation enough for me." As if summoned by his name, the dog trotted over and nudged Lark's hand with his nose. She laughed, the first genuine laugh Jed had heard from her, and the sound filled the barn like music. "I think the feeling is mutual," she said, ruffling Rex's fur. "It's been a long time since I had a friend who didn't want something from me." The comment carried more weight than she probably intended, revealing the loneliness and wariness that had shaped her recent experiences. Jed understood that feeling, the gradual erosion of trust that came from too many disappointments, too many people who saw you as useful rather than valuable. "Well," he said, "Rex and I aren't going anywhere, and neither are you until you're ready. No strings attached." She looked up at him then, and he saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. Not just gratitude, but something warmer and more complex. Recognition, maybe, of kindred spirits finding each other in an unlikely place. "I believe you," she said quietly. "And that's a gift I hadn't expected to find out here." As they walked back to the cabin for lunch, Jed caught his reflection in the water trough again. The face that looked back at him seemed somehow different. But it had that morning softer around the edges, more alive. For the first time in 7 years, he thought about shaving off his beard, about taking more care with his appearance. The thought should have alarmed him, should have sent him reaching for the familiar walls he'd built around his heart. Instead, it filled him with something that felt suspiciously like hope. 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt both new and ancient, as if Jed and Lark were rediscovering something fundamental about human companionship that civilization had complicated. Beyond recognition, they worked together through the morning hours mending fences, tending cattle, repairing the small damages that winter inflicted on a working ranch. In the afternoons, when the day's labor was done, they found themselves drawn to the cabins. Warmth and the quiet pleasure of shared tasks, that it was during one such afternoon that Jed discovered Lark could read. He'd been puzzling over a letter from the territorial government regarding grazing rights, squinting at the official language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify, when she quietly appeared at his shoulder. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the document. He handed it over, expecting her to glance at it politely before admitting defeat. Instead, she studied it with the focused attention of someone accustomed to deciphering complex text, her lips moving slightly as she worked. through the bureaucratic maze. They're saying you need to register your water rights separately from your grazing rights, she said after a few minutes. There's a new territorial law requiring documentation of all water sources used for livestock. You have until the end of March to file the paperwork, or they can declare your creek access forfeit. Jed stared at her, then at the letter, then back at her. You got all that from this gibberish? I had to read a lot of legal documents when I was settling my parents' affairs. She set the letter down carefully, smoothing the creases with her fingertips. Officials love to use 10 words where one would do. Makes them feel important. Well, I'll be damned. He shook his head in wonder. Here I was planning to ride into town and pay the lawyer $2 just to translate this thing. Save your money. I can help you with the paperwork if you'd like. I have a fair hand with writing, and I know how to phrase things so they sound official enough to satisfy bureaucrats. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it shifted something in their arrangement. She wasn't just accepting his charity anymore. She was contributing skills he genuinely needed. The partnership felt more balanced, more like what it was becoming, rather, than what it had started as. That evening, as they worked by lamplight to complete the water rights documentation, Lark began to hum softly under her breath. The melody was unfamiliar but beautiful, rising and falling like birdsong at dawn. Jed found himself pausing in his work to listen, charmed by this glimpse into her private world. That's a pretty tune, he said when she finished. What is it? She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't realized she'd been humming aloud. Oh, just something my mother used to sing. A lullaby, I think, though I never learned all the words. You have a lovely voice. Color rose in her cheeks. I used to sing in the church choir back home. Before ... She gestured vaguely, encompassing all the losses that had brought her to this place. Would you sing something now? Something with words? She hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small, water-damaged book. The cover was barely legible, but Jed could make out the words "Songs and Hymns" in faded gold lettering. I managed to save this, she said, handling the book with the reverence reserved for precious things. It was my mother's. Most of the pages are ruined, but a few are still readable. She opened to a page near the middle, her fingers finding the familiar words despite the water stains. When she began to sing, her voice filled the cabin with a sweetness that made Rex lift his head from his place by the fire. Come, thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy, never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. The hymn was familiar to Jed from his childhood, before the war had complicated his relationship with faith, but hearing it in Lark's clear soprano gave it new meaning. She sang not with the mechanical precision of forced devotion, but with the genuine feeling of someone who had found comfort in the words during dark times. When she finished, silence settled over the cabin like a gentle benediction. Jed found himself reluctant to break it with ordinary conversation. That was beautiful, he said finally. Your mother taught you well. She said music was prayer made audible. Lark closed the songbook carefully, her fingers lingering on the young, worn cover. I haven't sung much since she died. It felt too sad, somehow. But tonight, ... double quotes, tonight? Tonight it felt like gratitude instead of grief. The simple statement hit Jed with unexpected force. He understood what she meant, that subtle shift from mourning what was lost to appreciating what remained. It was a transition he'd been struggling to make himself, though he hadn't quite realized it until she put it into words. Their evening routine had begun to establish itself over the past few days. After dinner, Lark would mend clothes or darn socks, while Jed worked on small repairs or read aloud from his worn copy of Whitman. She was a good listener, occasionally asking questions about a particular passage or offering her own interpretation of the poet's meaning. He's very optimistic, she observed one evening as Jed closed the book. All this celebration of life and humanity. Do you really believe that? That people are fundamentally good? It was a question that went to the heart of everything Jed had been wrestling with since the war. He'd seen too much cruelty, too much senseless violence to maintain the easy faith of his youth. But he'd also seen acts of incredible kindness, moments of grace that shone all the brighter for their rarity. "I want to," he said honestly. "Some days I think Whitman never saw what I saw, never had to kill a boy who wasn't old enough to shave. Other days, ... other days." He looked at her sitting there in the lamplight, her needle flashing as she repaired a tear in one of his shirts, and felt something ease in his chest. "Other days I think maybe he understood something I forgot. Maybe goodness isn't about never doing wrong. Maybe it's about choosing to do right when you have the chance." She nodded slowly, as if testing the idea against her own experiences. The Harrisons went to church every Sunday. They knew all the right words, made all the proper donations. But there was no kindness in them, no real goodness. "You've never quoted scripture to me, never talked about righteousness, but you pulled a stranger out of a storm and asked for nothing in return. That's just human decency." "No," she said firmly. "Human decency is what most people manage on their best days. What you did was grace." The word hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them wanted to examine too closely. Jed felt heat rise in his face and busied himself, banking the fire for the night. It was then that the nightmare came. He'd been sleeping better since Lark's arrival. The presence of another person, somehow holding his demons at bay. But that night, the dreams found him anyway, dragging him back to a muddy field outside Gettysburg, where the ground was red with blood and the air thick with smoke. He was running through the chaos, looking for his men, calling their names above the roar of cannon fire. But every face he found was wrong. Every voice that answered wasn't the one he needed to hear. Samuel Morrison lay dead in the mud, his chest torn open by grapeshot. Thomas Kelly reached out with arms that ended in bloody stumps. Captain Hayes stood with his back to Jed, and when he turned around, his face was gone. Jed woke with a strangled cry, his body soaked in sweat despite the cabin's chill. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was, couldn't separate the nightmare from reality. Then he heard Lark's voice, soft and soothing in the darkness. "Jed, are you all right?" She was sitting up in the bed, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes wide with concern. Rex had moved from his place by the fire to Yet's side, whining softly as he pressed against his master's leg. "Sorry," Jed managed, his voice rough with sleep and terror. "Didn't mean to wake you. Don't apologize." She slipped out of bed, barefoot on the cold floor, and knelt beside his makeshift bedroll. "Bad dream?" He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The images were still too fresh, too real. He could smell the gunpowder, hear the screams of wounded horses, feel the weight of all the men he'd failed to save. Would it help to talk about it? The offer was gentle, without pressure or judgment. She'd shared her own pain with him. Perhaps it was time to return the trust. "The war," he said simply. "It comes back sometimes. The men I lost, the choices I made, the choice I didn't make." She settled beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to respect his space. What choice? There was a boy. Couldn't have been more than 16, wearing a Confederate uniform that was too big for him. He was wounded, calling for his mother. "I had a clear shot, and I took it." The words tasted like ashes in his mouth. Orders were orders. Enemy was enemy. But he was just a scared kid who probably lied about his age to join up with his friends. "You were a soldier. You did what soldiers do. I was a killer. There's a difference." He scrubbed his hands over his face, trying to erase the memory that would never fade. "That boy's face is the last thing I see every night, and the first thing I see every morning. He haunts me more than the men I lost, because losing them wasn't my choice. Killing him was." Lark was quiet for a long moment, and Jed braced himself for the usual platitudes about duty and necessity that people offered when they didn't understand the weight of taking a life. Instead, she surprised him. "Have you forgiven yourself?" The question was so unexpected, so direct, that it took his breath away. "What? Have you forgiven yourself for surviving when others didn't? For doing terrible things because terrible times demanded them? For being human in a situation that stripped away humanity?" "I don't deserve forgiveness. That's not what I asked." Her voice was patient but firm. Deserving has nothing to do with it. Forgiveness isn't a reward for good behavior. Sometimes, it's just the only way to keep breathing. She reached out tentatively and touched his hand, her fingers warm against his cold skin. I don't know anything about war, but I know about carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you. I know about letting the worst thing you've ever done define everything you are. What's the worst thing you've ever done? She was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I let Mr. Harrison touch me. Not once, but multiple times over several months. I told myself I didn't have a choice, that I needed the job, that no one would believe me if I spoke up. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of being homeless, afraid of having nothing. So I let him hurt me rather than face the uncertainty of leaving. Jed felt anger rise in his chest, hot and protective. That wasn't your fault. He was the one with power, the one who should have known better. But I could have left sooner. I could have found another way. Instead, I stayed and let it happen because staying felt safer than going. She wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her free hand. Do you think less of me for that? No, he said immediately, fiercely. I think you survived the only way you could. I think you were brave enough to finally leave when leaving felt impossible. Then maybe you can extend the same grace to yourself that you just offered me. The simple wisdom of it stopped him cold. He looked at her sitting there, beside him in the dim cabin, this woman who'd walked across hostile territory with nothing but hope and determination, and saw something he'd forgotten existed. Unconditional acceptance of human frailty. I don't know how, he admitted. Neither do I, she said. But maybe we can figure it out together. Rex chose that moment to insert himself between them, resting his head on Yet's knee while his tail thumped against Lark's leg. The dog's simple presence somehow eased the weight of their shared confessions, reminding them that healing didn't always require grand gestures or profound insights. Sometimes it just required the patience to sit with pain until it transformed into something bearable. Thank you, Jed said, for listening, for understanding. Thank you for trusting me with it. They sat in comfortable silence while the fire settled into glowing embers and the night sounds of the desert filtered through the cabin walls. When Lark finally returned to bed, Jed found that sleep came easier, the nightmares held at bay by the knowledge that he wasn't carrying his burdens alone anymore. For the first time in 7 years, he wasn't afraid of his dreams. A week into their unlikely partnership, the inevitable happened. Jed needed supplies, and that meant a trip to Socorro. He'd been putting it off, reluctant to expose Lark to the scrutiny of small-town curiosity. But his coffee had run out 3 days ago, and they were down to their last can of beans. I could stay here, Lark suggested as he hitched his horse to the small wagon he used for supply runs. Keep an eye on the cattle, make sure the fire doesn't die. Jed paused in his work, considering. The offer was practical. Someone should stay with the livestock, and it would avoid uncomfortable questions about his mysterious houseguest. But something in her tone suggested the suggestion came from anxiety rather than logic. You afraid of town folks? He asked gently. Not afraid exactly. She smoothed her skirts, a nervous gesture he'd learned to recognize. But I'm not naive either. A strange woman living with a bachelor rancher will generate talk, and talk has a way of traveling. She was right, of course. Socorro was a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the arrival of an unattached woman would be noted, discussed, and probably embellished beyond recognition before sunset. Well, Jed said finally, the way I see it, we have 2 choices. We can try to hide you, which will just make folks more curious when they eventually find out about you. Or we can face the gossip head on, let people draw their own conclusions, and not give them any more fuel than necessary. What would you prefer? The question caught him off guard. In 7 years of solitude, he'd grown accustomed to making decisions based purely on his own needs and preferences. Having someone else's comfort to consider felt both foreign and surprisingly natural. I'd prefer to have you with me, he said, then felt heat rise in his face at how the words sounded. That is, I could use your help with the shopping. You know better than I do what we actually need for the cabin. She smiled at his awkwardness, but kindly. Then I guess we're going to town. The 15-mile ride to Socorro passed in comfortable conversation, with Lark pointing out details of the landscape he'd stopped noticing years ago. She had an artist's eye for beauty, finding wonder in the way morning light painted the canyon walls, the graceful flight of hawks riding the thermals, the delicate frost patterns that decorated the sagebrush. "It's magnificent," she said as they crested the hill that revealed the town spread out in the valley below. "So much space, so much sky. Back east, everything feels cramped and closed in by comparison." Socorro in December was a collection of adobe and wooden buildings huddled around a central plaza, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear winter air. The town served as a trading post for the scattered ranchers and miners who worked the surrounding territory. And even on a weekday morning, the streets showed signs of activity. Jed guided the wagon to Gonzalez General Store, where Martha and Fernando had been providing necessities to the local population for nearly 2 decades. As they climbed down from the wagon, he saw curtains twitching in nearby windows and knew their arrival had been noted. "Remember," he murmured to Lark as they approached the store, "you're Miss Meadows, temporarily staying at my place while you recover from travel fatigue. Keep it simple." Martha Gonzalez looked up from her inventory ledger as they entered, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. She was a woman in her 50s, plump and energetic, with the kind of warm personality that made her the unofficial social center of Socorro's small community. "Jedediah Hart," she exclaimed, "don't you look fine this morning? And who is this lovely young lady?" "Mrs. Gonzalez, I'd like you to meet Miss Lark Meadows. She's been staying at my place while she recovers from a difficult journey west." Martha's gaze took in every detail of Lark's appearance, from her carefully pinned hair to her mended dress, with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to gathering information quickly. "Miss Meadows, how delightful. We don't get many visitors during the winter months. Where are you traveling from, dear?" "Kansas City, ma'am," Lark replied, her voice steady despite what Jed could see was growing nervousness. "I was hoping to reach the mining camps, but I'm afraid I underestimated the distances involved." "Oh, my dear, you certainly did. Those camps are another 100 miles west, and no place for a lady traveling alone. You're lucky Jed found you when he did." The conversation continued in this vein as they gathered supplies, with Martha asking seemingly innocent questions that Lark deflected with polite vagueness. Jed found himself admiring her composure. She gave the impression of openness while revealing virtually nothing of substance. They were loading their purchases into the wagon when Sheriff Benjamin Cole approached, his badge catching the morning sunlight. Cole was a decent man, competent at his job, but perhaps too fond of his own authority for Yet's taste. "Morning, Jed." "Ma'am." He touched his hat brim to Lark. "Haven't seen you around town, miss. You new to the territory?" "Miss Meadows is recovering from travel at my place," Jed said before Lark could respond. "She got caught in that storm last week. Needed somewhere to warm up and rest." Cole's eyes sharpened with professional interest. "Storm was pretty bad. Lucky you found shelter when you did, miss. Could have been dangerous, traveling alone in weather like that." "Yes," Lark agreed quietly. "Mr. Hart's kindness likely saved my life. I'm sure it did." The sheriff's tone suggested he was filing away every detail for future consideration. "You planning to stay in Socorro long?" "That depends on several factors," Lark replied diplomatically. "I'm still considering my options." Cole nodded, but Jed caught the speculative look in his eyes. The lawman was wondering about a woman traveling alone, questioning her story without quite accusing her of dishonesty. "Well," Cole said finally, "if you need anything official-like, you know where to find me." As they drove out of town, Jed noticed more curtains twitching, more faces peering from doorways and windows. By evening, he knew, their visit would be the subject of conversation in every household in Socorro. "That went well," Lark said once they were safely away from the town's borders. "You think so?" "The sheriff suspects something, but he doesn't." "Know what? Mrs. Gonzalez is curious, but friendly. And everyone else is probably just excited to have something new to talk about." She turned to study his profile. "How long before the gossip reaches truly problematic levels?" Jed considered the question seriously. Depends on what kind of gossip it is. If folks just think you're a woman who got stranded, and I'm helping you out, that's one thing. If they start imagining more improper arrangements, ... then what? And we might have bigger problems than idle curiosity. They rode in thoughtful silence for several miles, each lost in their own concerns. The supplies they'd purchased would last a month, maybe longer with careful management, but eventually they'd need to return to town. And each visit would generate more questions, more speculation about the nature of their relationship. Jed, Lark said, as they approached the turnoff to his ranch, what if we told people we were engaged? The suggestion hit him like a physical blow. He nearly dropped the reins, causing the horse to snort and shake his head in protest. Engaged? Think about it, she continued, apparently oblivious to his shock. An engaged couple living together would be unusual, but not scandalous, especially in frontier circumstances. It would explain my presence, give me a legitimate reason to stay and stop most of the gossip before it starts. But we're not engaged. No, but we could pretend to be. Temporarily, just until I figure out what to do next. Jed found himself struggling with a tangle of emotions he couldn't quite identify. The practical part of his mind recognized the wisdom of her suggestion. A fictional engagement would indeed solve many of their immediate problems. But the thought of claiming Lark as his intended bride, even falsely, stirred feelings he wasn't prepared to examine. People would expect us to marry eventually, he pointed out. You can't stay engaged forever without raising new questions. I could leave before it becomes an issue. Head further west once winter passes and travel becomes easier. The casual way she mentioned leaving felt like a punch to his solar plexus. Over the past week, he'd grown accustomed to her presence in ways that surprised him. The thought of returning to his solitary existence now seemed unbearably bleak. Or, she continued, apparently unaware of his internal turmoil, we could stage a broken engagement. Have a dramatic falling out that gives me a reason to leave town in a huff. People love that kind of romantic drama. And what reason would we give for this falling out? She was quiet for a moment, working through the logistics. Irreconcilable. Differences? Your unwillingness to leave the ranch? My desire for city life? The details don't matter as much as the story. They had reached his property line, and Jed guided the wagon toward the cabin while wrestling with the implications of her proposal. On one hand, a fake engagement would provide them both with protection from gossip and suspicion. On the other hand, it felt like playing with forces he didn't fully understand. There's risk in it, he said finally. If people find out we're lying, it'll be worse than if we just told the truth from the beginning. What truth? That you found a stranger half dead in a snowstorm and took her in? That's not much of a story, and it leaves too many questions unanswered. She was right, but Jed found himself reluctant to agree to the deception for reasons he couldn't articulate. Perhaps it was because the lie felt too close to something he was beginning to want in reality. Let me think about it, he said as they pulled up to the cabin. It's not a decision to make lightly, of course. She began gathering packages from the wagon bed. I didn't mean to pressure you. It was just a thought. But as they unloaded their supplies and settled back into their domestic routine, Jed found his mind returning to her suggestion repeatedly. The idea of introducing Lark as his fiancée, of having the right to stand beside her in public, to claim her as his own, held an appeal that had nothing to do with practical considerations and everything to do with desires he'd thought buried forever. That evening, as they sat by the fire, sharing the bottle of whiskey he'd purchased in town, Lark brought up the subject again. I've been thinking about our conversation earlier, she said, staring into the amber liquid in her glass. About the engagement idea. I want you to know that if you're uncomfortable with the deception, I understand completely. I don't want to put you in a position that compromises your integrity. It's not about integrity, Jed replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. It's about ... complications. What kind of complications? He set down his glass and looked at her directly. This woman who'd somehow become essential to his Bailey happiness in the space of a week. The kind where we start pretending something that might not be entirely pretense. The words hung between them like a bridge that neither was quite ready to cross. Lark's eyes widened slightly, and he saw. Understanding dawned in their brown depths. "Oh," she said softly. "Yeah, oh." They sat in silence for several minutes, the crackling fire the only sound in the cabin. Rex dozed between them, oblivious to the emotional undercurrents that suddenly seemed to charge the air with electricity. "So what do we do?" Lark asked finally. Jed looked at her sitting there in the firelight, her hair catching golden highlights, her face soft with an expression he didn't dare interpret, and felt his carefully constructed walls crumble a little more. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we'd better figure it out soon, because whatever's happening between us, it's bigger than either of us planned on." The conversation they'd started by the fire continued in fragments over the following days, neither quite willing to address it directly, but both unable to ignore the shift in atmosphere between them. They moved around each other with a new awareness, careful not to let their hands brush when passing tools, hyper-conscious of the small intimacies that had developed naturally in their shared routine. It was while cleaning the cabin 3 days later that Lark made the discovery that changed everything. She was dusting the mantelpiece above the fireplace when her cloth caught on a loose stone. As she tried to work it free, the stone shifted, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, was a simple gold band. "Jed," she called, her voice strange. He looked up from the harness he was mending at the kitchen table, saw what she held in her palm, and went very still. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I wasn't snooping. The stone was loose, and when I tried to push it back. It's all right." He set down his work and crossed to where she stood, his movements careful and deliberate. I'd forgotten it was there. The ring was beautiful in its simplicity, a narrow gold band worn smooth by years of wear, with a delicate pattern of leaves etched around its circumference. It was clearly a woman's wedding ring, and clearly precious to whoever had owned it. "It was my mother's," Jed said quietly, taking the ring from Lark's palm. "She gave it to me before I went to war, told me to save it for the woman I wanted to marry." Lark felt her breath catch. "Your mother double quotes, died while I was fighting. Fever took her in the winter of '63. I got the letter 3 months after she'd been buried." He turned the ring over in his fingers, his expression distant with memory. "I used to carry it with me, thinking about the future she'd wanted me to have. Wife, children, a normal life. After Gettysburg, after everything went wrong, I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. But you kept it. Couldn't bring myself to throw it away either. So I hid it, figured I'd let it gather dust until I was too old to remember what hope felt like." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken possibilities. Lark stared at the ring, understanding instinctively that this moment was crucial, that whatever happened next would determine the direction of both their lives. "What was she like?" she asked finally. "Your mother?" A smile ghosted across Yet's features. "Strong, stubborn. She could make a meal out of nothing and make it taste like a feast. She believed in second chances, in the power of kindness to heal old wounds." He looked at Lark directly. "She would have liked you. How can you be sure?" "Because she always said the measure of a person wasn't what they had, but what they did with what they'd been given. You've had plenty of reasons to become bitter, to close your heart to the world. Instead, you sing to my cattle and mend my clothes and make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep." Tears pricked at Lark's eyes. "Jed. I know we've only known each other 2 weeks. I know you're still healing from what happened to you back east, and I'm still carrying ghosts from the war. But when I look at you, when I watch you bring life back to this place, double quotes," he paused, seeming to gather courage. "When I look at you, I remember what it feels like to want something more than just survival." She set the ring carefully on the mantelpiece, her hands trembling slightly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that fake engagement you suggested. Maybe it doesn't have to be fake." The words hung between them like a prayer, fragile and full of desperate hope. Lark felt her heart race, torn between the longing that had been growing in her chest and the fear that still whispered warnings about trusting too much, too soon. Jed, we barely know each other. I know you're brave enough to walk across hostile territory rather than accept abuse. I know you're kind enough to sing lullabies to animals. I know you have nightmares about the past, but still believe in the possibility of a better future. He stepped closer, his voice soft but steady. I know that when you smile, something in my chest comes alive that I thought was dead forever. And I know you're the first man who's ever looked at me and seen someone worth protecting rather than using. I know you write letters to dead friends because you can't bear to let them go. I know you're gentler with wounded things than anyone has a right to be. She met his eyes, seeing her own hopes and fears reflected there. But knowing those things and being ready for marriage are different matters entirely. Are they? He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hands in his. My mother used to say that love wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone whose imperfections fit with yours in a way that made both of you stronger. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. And she'd tell us that waiting for perfect circumstances just means waiting forever. His thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. I can't promise you easy, Lark. This life is hard, and I'm not a man who knows how to speak pretty words or buy fancy things. But I can promise you respect, partnership, and a love that grows stronger every day instead of wearing thin. She looked at their joined hands, feeling the calluses on his palms that spoke of honest work, the strength that had never been used to hurt her, only to help. And what about children? Don't you want a family? I want whatever family we make. Together, whether that's just you and me and Rex, or whether it includes little ones who sing like their mother and have their father's stubborn streak. The image he painted was so achingly beautiful that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. She'd given up dreaming of such things during her months with the Harrisons, had convinced herself that safety was the most she could hope for. But here was Jed offering not just safety, but partnership, not just protection, but love. What about my past? The accusations, the possibility that the law might come looking for me? Then we'll face it together. As husband and wife, they'd have a harder time forcing you to return east. And if they tried, his jaw tightened. Well, they'd have to go through me first. You'd risk that? For me? Lark, I'd risk anything for you. The question is whether you're willing to risk your heart on a broken-down cowboy who's never been good at anything but fighting and wrenching. She studied his face, seeing past the scars and weathering to the man beneath flawed but honest. Wounded but healing, offering her something she'd never expected to find. The practical part of her mind cataloged all the reasons why this was happening too fast, why she should be more cautious, why marriage to a virtual stranger was the height of foolishness. But her heart, the part of her that had been singing, since the day he'd carried her from the frozen creek, whispered that sometimes the best decisions were the ones that made no sense to anyone but the people making them. There's something I need to tell you first, she said, about the money I took from the Harrisons. You don't need to. You don't need to. Yes, I do. If we're going to do this, if we're going to build something real together, then we build it on truth. She took a steadying breath. I did take money from them. $43 that represented 6 months of wages they'd refused to pay me. But that's not all. When Mr. Harrison cornered me in the pantry for the last time, when he tore my dress, and I finally fought back. She touched her cheek unconsciously. I hit him with a cast iron skillet. Hard enough to knock him unconscious. Hard enough that I thought I might have killed him. Yet's hands tightened on hers, but not in rejection. In support. Mrs. Harrison found us there, him on the floor, me standing over him with the skillet in my hands. She screamed, called me a thief and a violent criminal. Said she'd have me arrested, that no one would believe my word against theirs. Lark's voice grew stronger as she continued. So I took my wages from the household money, packed what few belongings I could carry, and ran. I don't know if he was seriously hurt. I don't know if they really reported me to the authorities. But I know that if they did, my story sounds like the desperate lies of a caught criminal. And my story sounds like the truth, Jed said firmly. Which it is. You defended yourself against a man who was assaulting you. You took only what you were owed. Anyone who thinks that makes you a criminal has never faced what you faced. But if the law comes looking, then we tell them exactly what you just told me. And if that's not enough, then we find somewhere else to build our life. There's a whole territory out here, Lark. Room enough for anyone willing to work for what they want. She looked at him, this man who'd offered her everything without hesitation, who'd listened to her darkest truth and responded with acceptance rather than judgment, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. Ask me, she whispered. What? Ask me properly. If you're going to propose marriage to a woman, she deserves to be asked properly. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something that looked like joy. He released her hands and reached for the ring on the mantelpiece, then dropped to one knee on the rough wooden floor of his cabin. Miss Lark Meadows, he said, his voice formal but warm, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? She looked down at him kneeling there, holding his mother's ring, offering her a future she'd never dared to imagine, and felt her heart expand with something too big and bright to contain. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, Jedediah Hart, I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been waiting all these years for her hand, and rose to his feet. For a moment, they stood there, suddenly shy in the face of the commitment they'd just made, uncertain how to navigate this new territory between them. Then Lark reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the rasp of his beard against her palm, and whispered, kiss me. He bent his head and brushed his lips against hers, soft and gentle, and full of promise. It was nothing like the rough pawing she'd endured from Mr. Harrison. This was reverent, asking rather than taking, giving rather than demanding. When they broke apart, both were breathless. Well, Jed said, resting his forehead against hers, I guess we're engaged for real now. I guess we are. She looked down at the ring on her finger, marveling at how right it felt there. When should we marry? Soon, he said without hesitation. Before either of us has time to get sensible and change our minds. And before the next storm brings any more complications to our door. As if summoned by his words, Rex chose that moment to bound through the door, tail wagging furiously as he sensed the happiness in the room. He circled them both, barking with joy, as if he understood that his pack had just become permanent. I think Rex approves, Lark laughed, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Rex has good judgment about people. Jed pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side. Almost as good as his master. Outside, the winter wind began to pick up, promising another cold night. But inside the cabin, wrapped in each other's arms and warmed by new love, neither Jed nor Lark felt the chill. They'd found something worth more than comfort, more valuable than safety. They'd found home. 3 days into their engagement, while they were still floating in the golden haze of new love and planning their simple wedding ceremony, Sheriff Cole arrived at Yet's ranch with news that shattered their peaceful world. Like a rock through glass, Jed saw the dust cloud long before the rider came into view, and something in his gut told him this wasn't a social call. He was mending fence with Lark, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked, her engagement ring catching the afternoon sunlight. The approaching horse interrupted their comfortable rhythm and brought attention to the air that made Rex growl low in his throat. Sheriff, Jed said as Cole reined in his mount near the fence line. Wasn't expecting company. Cole dismounted, his expression grim beneath the brim of his hat. Jed, Miss Meadows. He touched his hat to Lark, but his usual courtesy seemed strained. I'm afraid this isn't a pleasure call. Mind if I have a word with you both? Lark went very still beside Jed, her face pale as winter sky. She'd been watching the horizon for trouble since the day they'd met, and now it seemed trouble had finally found them. Of course, Jed said, though his voice carried a warning edge. What's on your mind, Ben? The sheriff reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a folded paper, yellow with travel and official seals. Got this telegram 3 days ago from a U.S. Marshal in Kansas City. Seems there's been some inquiries about a young woman matching Miss Meadows' description. Lark's hand found Yet's arm, her fingers gripping tight enough to leave marks. "What kind of inquiries?" Cole unfolded the paper, his weathered features creased with what might have been regret. "Says here a prominent St. Louis businessman named Harrison is looking for a former employee. Woman named Elizabeth Morrison, though she might be using an assumed name. Accused of theft and assault." He looked up at Lark directly. "Description. Matches you pretty well, miss. Dark hair, brown eyes, about 5'4", traveling alone westward." The silence that followed was deafening. Jed felt Lark's grip on his arm tighten further, felt her whole body tense, like a deer scenting wolves. His own mind raced through possibilities, calculations, the legal realities of territorial law enforcement. "That's a common enough description," he said carefully. "Could be describing half the women in the territory." "Could be," Cole agreed. "But how many of them showed up in the past month, traveling alone from back east, with no clear story about where they came from or where they're headed?" "Sheriff," Lark said, her voice steadier than Jed had expected, "are you accusing me of something?" "I'm not accusing anyone of anything yet, miss. I'm just asking questions that need asking." Cole folded the telegram carefully and tucked it back into his shirt pocket. "The thing is, this Harrison fellow has some influential friends. Friends who can make life complicated for anyone harboring a fugitive from justice." Jed stepped slightly forward, putting himself between Cole and Lark. "Ben, you've known me for 7 years. Have I ever given you cause to doubt my word? No, you haven't. That's why I'm here talking, instead of just arresting her based on the description." Cole's expression softened slightly. "I like you, Jed. You're a good man who minds his own business and pays his debts. That's why I'm hoping you can help me understand why a woman matching a wanted criminal's description just happened to end up at your isolated ranch. Because she was half dead from cold and exhaustion, and I'm not the kind of man who leaves folks to die in storms." Yet's voice carried the ring of absolute truth. "You want to know her story, Ben? Her name is Lark Meadows. She was working as a governess for a family that treated her badly, and when she tried to leave, they made up charges to keep her trapped. She came west looking for a fresh start, same as half the people in this territory. And you're willing to vouch for that?" "I'm willing to stake my reputation on it." Cole nodded slowly, but his expression remained troubled. "I appreciate that, Jed. I truly do. But the thing is, this isn't just about local law anymore. The telegram says a federal marshal might be heading this way to investigate. If that happens, this gets out of my hands entirely." Lark found her voice again, though it trembled slightly. "What exactly is Mr. Harrison claiming I stole?" $43 in cash, plus various personal items. Says you assaulted him when he confronted you about the theft." Cole's tone was carefully neutral, but Jed caught the skeptical note underlying his official manner. "Claims you hit him with a kitchen implement, left him unconscious." "And did this Mr. Harrison mention why I might have done such a thing?" "Says you were unbalanced, prone to violent outbursts and delusions. Claims he and his wife tried to help you, but you became increasingly erratic and threatening." Jed felt rage build in his chest like a prairie fire. The picture Cole was painting was a masterpiece of calculated lies, just enough truth, twisted with deliberate falsehoods to make Lark sound like a dangerous criminal rather than a victim who'd finally fought back. "That's a damned lie," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Maybe so. But lies backed by powerful men can be harder to fight than honest truths spoken by folks without connections." Cole looked genuinely sympathetic now. "I'm sorry, Miss Meadows. I wish I had better news. But the reality is, if a federal marshal shows up with an arrest warrant, I won't have any choice but to turn you over." "When?" Lark asked. "When might this marshal arrive?" "Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how much pressure this Harrison fellow can bring to bear, and how much the federal authorities care about a theft case from Missouri." Cole remounted his horse, clearly uncomfortable with his role as bearer of bad news. "I wanted to give you both a chance to think about your options. If Miss Meadows wanted to head further west, now might be the time. Or," Jed said slowly, an idea taking shape in his mind, "she might want to consider getting married." A woman's legal status changes considerably when she becomes a wife, especially out here in the territories. Cole's eyebrows rose. You two thinking about matrimony? We're engaged, Lark said, lifting her hand to show the ring. We've been planning a ceremony. Well, I'll be damned. Cole actually smiled for the first time since his arrival. Congratulations. To you both. When's the wedding? Soon, Jed said firmly. Very soon. Might be wise to make it sooner rather than later, Cole agreed. A married woman has certain protections under territorial law that an unmarried one doesn't. And a husband has the right to defend his wife against what he considers false accusations. After the sheriff left, Jed and Lark stood in the gathering dusk, watching his dust trail disappear toward town. The weight of their changed circumstances pressed down on them like an approaching storm front. So much for our peaceful engagement, Lark said finally, her voice brittle with forced lightness. Lark, Jed turned to face her, taking her hands in his. Tell me the truth, all of it. If we're going to fight this together, I need to know exactly what we're up against. She took a shaky breath. His name is Charles Harrison. He owns a shipping company, sits on the boards of 3 banks, and has dinner with the mayor twice a month. When I worked for his family, he made it clear from the beginning that my employment included certain unspoken expectations. What kind of expectations? The kind that involved coming to my room late at night when his wife was visiting friends. The kind that meant I couldn't lock my door without being accused of impertinence. The kind that made it clear my job security depended on my compliance with his demands. Yet's hands clenched into fists. How long? 4 months. 4 months of telling myself it would get better, that I could endure it until I saved enough money to leave. But he never paid me my full wages. There was always some excuse room and board costs, expenses for my uniforms, charges for dishes. I'd supposedly broken. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. The night I finally fought back, he was drunk. Drunker than usual. He tore my dress, said things. Said he was tired of my reluctance, that it was time I showed proper gratitude for his generosity. So you hit him. I hit him with the first thing I could reach. A cast iron skillet from the kitchen counter. I didn't mean to hit him so hard, but I was terrified and angry and desperate. Tears ran down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. When Mrs. Harrison found us, I was still holding the skillet. He was unconscious, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. She started screaming, calling me names, threatening to have me arrested for attempted murder. So you took your wages and ran. I took what he owed me from the household money. 6 months of wages at $7 a month. I left behind everything. Else my clothes, my books, my mother's jewelry. Everything except what I could carry in a small bag. Jed pulled her into his arms, feeling her tremble against his chest. You did nothing wrong, Lark. Nothing. A man like that, with his kind of power, he counts on his victims being too scared or ashamed to fight back. But you fought back. And now he's using that fight to destroy me. He knows I can't return to St. Louis to defend myself. He knows that out here, his word carries more weight than mine. She pulled back to look at his face. Jed, I won't let him destroy you too. If staying here puts you at risk, stop. His voice was firm but gentle. We're in this together now. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, remember? We haven't said those vows yet? Then maybe it's time we did. He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away her tears. Lark, I meant what I said to the sheriff. I'm willing to stake everything on you. My reputation, my ranch, my freedom if it comes to that. But I need to know you're willing to fight for us too. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd offered her everything without reservation, who'd listened to her darkest truths and responded with love instead of judgment. The fear that had been her constant companion for months began to transform into something else. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of something stronger. What do you need me to do? Marry me tomorrow, before any federal marshals show up, before Harrison's influence can reach us here. Become my wife in the eyes of God and the law, and let me show this bastard what happens when he comes after my family. She stood on her toes and kissed him, fierce and desperate and full of all the words she couldn't speak. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, tomorrow. Yes, to everything." As they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, Rex trotting beside them, neither spoke of the challenges that lay ahead. There would be time enough for strategy and preparation, for gathering allies and building defenses against the storm that was coming. Tonight, there was only the warmth of the fire, the comfort of shared purpose, and the knowledge that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The game had changed, but they were no longer playing alone. Dawn came with the crisp promise of a December morning that would change their lives forever. Jed woke before first light, his mind already racing through the preparations necessary for their hastily arranged wedding. They had perhaps hours before federal authorities might arrive, and those hours had to be used wisely. Lark was already awake, sitting by the window in her mended dress, watching the horizon with the alertness of someone who'd learned to expect trouble from any direction. She'd braided her hair carefully and pinned it up in a style that made her look older, more settled, like a woman ready for marriage rather than a girl running from her past. "Any regrets?" Jed asked softly, not wanting to startle her from her vigil. She turned to him with a smile that was equal parts nervous and determined. "About marrying you?" "None." "About the circumstances forcing our hand?" "I have regrets about that, but not about the choice itself." He crossed to her and placed his hands on her shoulders, feeling the tension coiled there like a spring. "We'll get through this, Lark. Whatever comes, we'll face it as husband and wife." "I know." She leaned back against his chest, drawing strength from his steadiness. "What do we need to do? First, we ride to town and find Father Miguel. He's a good man, and he won't ask too many questions about why we're in such a hurry. Then we'll need witnesses. Martha and Fernando will do, if they're willing. After that... He paused, considering their options. "After that, we make it legal, in the eyes of territorial law, and we prepare for whatever Harrison throws at us." They ate a quick breakfast of coffee and biscuits, their usual comfortable routine edged with urgency. Rex sensed the tension and paced the cabin, whining softly, as he picked up on their anxiety. Outside, the winter air was sharp enough to cut, and their breath came in white puffs as they prepared the wagon for what might be their most important journey. The ride to Socorro passed in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of what they were about to do. It wasn't the wedding either of them had imagined in their youth. No family gathered, no celebration planned, no time for the careful courtship that usually preceded such a commitment. Instead, they were rushing toward matrimony with the desperation of people whose very survival might depend on it. "Jed," Lark said as the town came into view, "there's something else I need to tell you. About my real name." He glanced at her, noting the nervous way she twisted her engagement ring. "I figured Lark Meadows wasn't what you were born with. Elizabeth Morrison. Lark was my middle name. It's what my parents called me when I was small. Morrison was my father's name." She took a shaky breath. "I need you to know, in case it matters for the marriage certificate, in case they check records." "It doesn't matter to me what name you were born with," Jed said firmly. "But it's good that you told me. Shows we're building this marriage on honesty from the start." Father Miguel was in the church when they arrived, preparing for morning mass. He was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and gentle hands, who'd served the Socorro community for nearly 20 years. When Jed explained their urgent need for a wedding ceremony, the priest studied them both carefully. "This is sudden," he observed, not accusingly, but with the concern of a man who'd seen too many hasty marriages end in heartbreak. "Yes, Father." "It is," Jed admitted, "but not impulsive. We thought this through, and we're certain of our choice." "And you, my child?" Father Miguel asked Lark. "You're entering this marriage freely, without coercion?" "More freely than I've done anything in years," she replied with conviction that rang true even to her own ears. The priest nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll need witnesses, and we'll need to complete the proper documentation. Can you provide proof of identity?" Yet's heart sank. They'd anticipated this requirement, but hoped it might be overlooked in the informal atmosphere of frontier weddings. "Father, Miss Morrison's documents were lost during her journey west. Storm damage. Father Miguel's eyebrows rose slightly at the use of Morrison instead of Meadows, but he didn't comment on the discrepancy. I see. Well, in cases like this, sworn testimony from community members can suffice. Do you have people willing to vouch for your identities? I've lived here 7 years, Jed said. Ben Cole can vouch for me and the Gonzalez family. And for the bride? This was the delicate moment they'd been dreading. Lark had been in Socorro exactly once, hardly long enough to establish the kind of community standing that would normally be required. I can vouch for her character, Jed said carefully, as can the Gonzalez family, who met her when we came to town for supplies. That's irregular, Father Miguel said slowly, but not impossible. These are frontier circumstances. After all, people come and go with little documentation all the time. He studied Lark's face again. Child, you understand that marriage is a sacred covenant? Not something to be entered into lightly, even under difficult circumstances? I understand, Father, and I want you to know that Mr. Hart has been nothing but honorable in his treatment of me. If we're rushing the ceremony, it's because external circumstances demand it, not because either of us has anything to hide or be ashamed of. Priest seemed satisfied with her answer. Very well. Let me gather what we need, and we'll see about finding witnesses. Martha and Fernando Gonzalez were more than willing to serve as witnesses, though Martha's excitement at the romantic suddenness of the situation was tempered by motherly concern about the couple's haste. Are you certain, Mia? She asked Lark, as they prepared for the ceremony. Marriage is a big step, and you've known Jed such a short time. Mrs. Gonzalez, sometimes a short time with the right person teaches you more than years with the wrong one, Lark replied. Jed is a good man, the best man I've ever known. See, he is good. But goodness alone doesn't always make for happiness. In marriage? No, Lark agreed, but it makes a foundation that happiness can be built on. And that's more than many couples start with. As they gathered in the small church, Jed found himself thinking about all the elements missing from their wedding. No music except Father Miguel's voice. No flowers except the dried arrangements that decorated the altar year-round. No elaborate dress or formal suit, just their everyday clothes cleaned and pressed as best they could manage. No family to share their joy or offer their blessings. But when Lark appeared at the back of the church, her face radiant despite the simple circumstances, none of those absences seemed to matter. She walked toward him with steady steps, her eyes never leaving his face, and he understood that this moment was exactly what it needed to be, not the wedding they might have imagined in different circumstances, but the one that would bind them together against whatever storms lay ahead. Dearly beloved, Father Miguel began, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Jedediah Hart and Elizabeth Morrison in the sacred bond of matrimony. The ceremony itself was brief but profound. They spoke the ancient vows with full understanding of their weight, promising to love and honor each other through whatever challenges the future might bring. When Jed slipped his mother's ring onto Lark's finger for the second time, this time, in the presence of God and witnesses, it felt like a completion of something that had begun the night he'd found her by the frozen creek. You may kiss your bride, Father Miguel said with a smile that suggested he was quite pleased with his part in this love story. Jed cupped Lark's face in his hands and kissed her gently, sealing their commitment with tenderness rather than passion. When they broke apart, she was crying not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being safe, finally belonging somewhere, finally having someone who would stand with her against the world. Mrs. Hart, he whispered against her forehead, testing the sound of her new name. Mr. Hart, she replied, laughing through her tears. The paperwork was completed quickly, with Father Miguel filing the marriage certificate with the territorial authorities and providing the newlyweds with their own copy. As they prepared to leave the church, the priest pulled Jed aside. Son, I don't know what troubles you're expecting, but I want you to know that this community stands behind its own. If you need help, if there are challenges ahead, don't try to face them alone. Thank you, Father. That means more than you know. And Jed, That young woman loves you. I can see it in her eyes. Whatever brought her to you, whatever circumstances made this wedding necessary, don't doubt that what you have is real." They returned to the ranch as Mr. and Mrs. Hart, but the celebration was muted by the knowledge that their troubles were far from over. If anything, they might have just made themselves a bigger target for Harrison's vengeance. A married woman was harder to extradite, but a man harboring a fugitive wife might face federal charges himself. That evening, as they sat by the fire in their cabin now, truly their shared home, they talked seriously about what lay ahead. "We need to be prepared for different scenarios," Jed said, his arm around Lark's shoulders as she leaned against him. "If federal marshals come, they might try to arrest you immediately, or they might investigate first. If Harrison himself shows up, he might try to pressure local authorities or take matters into his own hands. What about running? Heading further west, maybe to California? It's an option. But running means giving up everything I've built here, and it means always looking over our shoulders. I'd rather make a stand if we can." Lark was quiet for a moment, considering their options. "There's another possibility. What if we got word to the authorities in St. Louis about what really happened? About Harrison's character? About why I really left? Who would believe the word of a woman who fled town after assaulting a prominent businessman? Maybe no one. But maybe someone. Maybe there are other women who worked for the Harrisons, other people who know what kind of man he really is." She turned to look at him directly. "Jed, men like Harrison don't usually limit their predatory behavior to one victim. If we could find others willing to speak up ... That's a long shot, and it would take time we might not have. Then we use the time we do have to build our defenses here. Document everything, gather witnesses to our character, make it as hard as possible for them to make their false charges stick." Jed nodded, impressed once again by her practical courage. "All right, tomorrow we start building our case. We talk to everyone who knows us, everyone who might be willing to testify to your character and my reputation. We gather every piece of evidence we can about your real reasons for leaving Missouri. And tonight?" He smiled and kissed the top of her head. "Tonight we're just newlyweds, grateful to have found each other and determined to build a life worth fighting for." As they prepared for bed, their first night as husband and wife, both knew that the battle for their future was just beginning. But they also knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, bound by love and law and the unshakable conviction that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. Outside, the winter wind began to pick up, rattling the cabin windows, and reminding them that storms could come from any direction, at any time. But inside, warmed by fire and love and newfound hope, Mr. and Mrs. Hart held each other close and refused to let fear steal their joy. They had today. They had each other. And for now, that was enough. The confrontation came 2 weeks later on a Tuesday morning when the winter sun hung low and pale in the desert sky. Jed was splitting wood behind the cabin, while Lark hung laundry on the line they'd strung between 2 posts, both of them settling into the comfortable rhythms of married life despite the sword hanging over their heads. Rex heard them first, his ears pricking forward and a low growl rumbling in his throat. Then came the sound of multiple horses, riding hard and fast toward the ranch. Jed dropped his axe and moved to Lark's side, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle he'd taken, to keep him close whenever they worked outside. "Inside," he said quietly. "Now." But it was too late for hiding. 3 riders crested the small rise that led to their property, and even at a distance, Jed could see the glint of federal badges and the purposeful way they approached. Behind them rode a 4th man well-dressed, soft around the middle, sitting his horse like someone unaccustomed to long rides, but determined to see this through personally. Charles Harrison had come to collect what he considered his due. "Mrs. Hart," Jed said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Go into the cabin and wait for me there. Whatever happens, don't come out until I call for you." "I won't hide while they—" "You will," he said firmly, turning to look at her directly. "This is exactly what we prepared for. Trust me to handle it." She searched his face, saw the calm determination there, and nodded. But instead of retreating immediately, she rose on her toes and kissed him fiercely. "I love you, Jedediah Hart. Don't you dare let them take me without a fight. I love you too, and they'll have to go through me first." The riders pulled up about 20 feet from the cabin, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold air. The lead marshal was a lean man in his 40s with steel-gray hair and the kind of eyes that had seen too much of human nature's darker side. His companions flanked him professionally, hands resting casually near their weapons. "Mr. Hart," the lead marshal said, touching his hat brim. "I'm U.S. Marshal Thomas Wade. These are Deputies Miller and Carmichael. I believe you know why we're here." "I have some idea," Jed replied, not moving from his position near the cabin door. "Though I'm curious why federal marshals are concerning themselves with what sounds like a local civil matter. When someone flees across state lines to avoid prosecution, it becomes a federal matter." Wade's voice was professionally neutral, but Jed caught the note of skepticism underneath. This was a man who dealt with enough false accusations to recognize the signs. "And who might you be looking for?" "A woman named Elizabeth Morrison, also known as Lark Meadows. We have reason to believe she's been staying on your property." Before Jed could respond, the soft man who'd ridden with them urged his horse forward. Up close, Harrison looked exactly like what he was, a man accustomed to having his way through money and influence rather than merit. His face was flushed from the hard ride, and there was something in his eyes that Jed recognized as the look of a predator who'd been denied his prey for too long. "Marshal, there she is." Harrison pointed toward the cabin window, where Lark's face was partially visible behind the curtain. "That's her. That's the woman who robbed me and tried to kill me." "Mr. Harrison," Wade said with a warning tone, "let me handle this." But Harrison was beyond listening to authority that wasn't his own. He climbed down from his horse with the awkward movements of someone unused to physical effort, his expensive boots lipping slightly in the ranch dirt. "Elizabeth." "Morrison," he called toward the cabin, his voice carrying an ugly note of triumph. "You've led me quite a chase. But it's over now. You're coming back to St. Louis to face justice for what you did." A cabin door opened, and Lark stepped out with her chin raised and her shoulders square. She'd changed into her best dress, the same one she'd worn for there, wetting and pinned her hair up in a style that made her look every inch the respectable married woman she now was. "My name," she said clearly, "is Mrs. Jedediah Hart, and I'm not going anywhere with you, Mr. Harrison." Harrison's face went purple at her calm defiance. "Your name is Elizabeth Morrison. You're a thief and a violent criminal, and you'll—" "That's enough," Wade interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Mr. Harrison, you'll let me conduct this interview, or you'll wait with the horses." The marshal turned to Lark, his expression more curious than hostile. "Ma'am, are you Elizabeth?" "Morrison, formerly employed by the Harrison family in St. Louis." "I am Elizabeth Hart, née Morrison. I was briefly employed by the Harrison family, yes." "And did you take $43 from the Harrison household without permission?" "I took 6 months of wages that were owed to me after Mr. Harrison repeatedly refused to pay what was agreed upon in my employment contract." "She's lying," Harrison burst out. "She was paid regularly, given room and board, treated like family." Lark's eyes flashed, and Jed saw the steel that had carried her across. Hostile territory shined through her composed exterior. "Treated like family? Is that what you call it when you come to my room at night? When you corner me in pantries and tell me that my continued employment depends on my willingness to—" "How dare you?" Harrison's voice cracked like a whip. "Marshal, don't listen to her desperate lies. She's a disturbed woman, prone to fantasies and violent outbursts. Ask my wife, ask any of our friends." "I plan to," Wade said dryly. "But first, I'd like to hear the rest of Mrs. Hart's story." Jed stepped forward, close enough to offer Lark support without interfering with the marshal's investigation. "Marshal Wade, my wife has been completely honest about her past from the moment she arrived here. She told me exactly what happened in St. Louis, and I believe every word." "Your wife?" Wade's eyebrows rose. "When did this marriage take place?" 2 weeks ago," Jed replied. Father Miguel performed the ceremony at the Socorro Church. We have the certificate filed with territorial authorities. Harrison made a sound like a strangled animal. A marriage of convenience, designed to avoid prosecution. Marshal, surely, you can see what I can see, Wade said, his voice taking on an edge that suggested his opinion of Harrison was deteriorating rapidly. Is a man who rode all the way from Missouri to personally pursue a woman who allegedly stole $43. That strikes me as either remarkably vindictive or remarkably personal. She tried to kill me, Harrison protested. Look, he turned his head to reveal a faint scar along his hairline. She attacked me with a deadly weapon. After you tore her. Dress and forced yourself on her, Lark said quietly. After months of telling me that my job depended on submitting to your advances. After your wife walked in and chose to blame me rather than face the truth about what kind of man she'd married. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Wade studied both accusers carefully, his experienced eyes reading the truth that lay beneath their competing narratives. Mr. Harrison, he said finally, in my experience, women who make false accusations of assault don't usually flee across 3 states to avoid prosecution. They usually make their accusations public and demand justice. She's cunning, and, in my experience, Wade continued, cutting off Harrison's protest, men who pursue their victims across state lines usually have more at stake than $43. Harrison's face went from purple to white. Marshal, I resent the implication. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts based on 30 years of law enforcement. Wade turned back to Lark. Mrs. Hart, do you have any witnesses to Mr. Harrison's behavior? Anyone who might corroborate your account? There were other servants in the household. A cook named Mrs. Brennan, a housemaid named Sarah. They knew what was happening, but they were too afraid to speak up. Their jobs depended on staying silent. And these women are still in Mr. Harrison's employ, as far as I know. Wade nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Hart, what can you tell me about your wife's condition when you found her? Jed felt the weight of this moment, understanding that his words might determine Lark's fate. She was half dead from exposure, Marshal. Starving, exhausted, clutching stale bread like it was precious. Her feet were torn from walking, her dress was damaged, and she was so terrified that the first thing she said was, "Don't send me back." That's not the behavior of someone running from justified charges. That's the behavior of someone running for her life. He's obviously been influenced by her lies, Harrison said desperately. She's manipulated him, used feminine wiles to, Mr. Harrison, Wade said with finality. I think I've heard enough from you for now. The marshal turned to his deputies, speaking in a low voice that didn't carry to the others. Jed watched their faces, trying to read the decision that would determine his and Lark's future. After several minutes of quiet conference, Wade approached the couple again. Mrs. Hart, he said, I'm going to need you to come with us to Socorro for further questioning. Not under arrest, he added quickly as Jed tensed, but for an official interview. And Mr. Hart, you're welcome to accompany your wife as her representative. Like hell, Harrison exploded. Marshal, I demand, Mr. Harrison, you'll get exactly what the law entitles you to, and nothing more, Wade snapped. And if I were you, I'd be very careful about making demands. False accusations are a serious offense, especially when they waste federal resources. As they prepared to ride to town, Lark took Yet's hand in hers, drawing strength from his steady presence. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since Harrison's arrival, she allowed herself to hope that truth might actually prevail over influence and money. The showdown they'd been dreading was finally here. Now they would learn whether justice was truly blind, or whether it could be bought by men who believed their wealth entitled them to own other human beings. The sheriff's office in Socorro had never hosted such a gathering. Marshal Wade commandeered Sheriff Cole's desk while his deputies positioned themselves strategically around the room. Harrison paced near the window like a caged animal, his earlier confidence beginning to crack under the marshal's obvious skepticism. Jed and Lark sat close together on wooden chairs, her hand in his, both drawing strength from their united front. Before we proceed, Wade announced, I want to make something clear. This is not a trial. This is an investigation into allegations that may or may not warrant federal prosecution. Everyone will have a chance to speak, and everyone will be treated with respect." He opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents. "Mr. Harrison, I've reviewed the complaint you filed in St. Louis. The charges are theft of $43 and assault with a deadly weapon. Is that correct?" "Yes, and I have witnesses. We'll get to witnesses. First, I want to hear your account of the events leading up to the alleged crimes." Harrison straightened his vest and launched into what was clearly a rehearsed narrative. According to his version, Elizabeth Morrison had been a difficult employee from the start, moody, ungrateful, prone to hysterical outbursts. She'd been treated with exceptional kindness by his family, even privileges far beyond what was typical for domestic help. "We tried to help her," Harrison said, his voice taking on the practiced sincerity of a man accustomed to swaying juries through emotion, rather than facts. "My wife even gave her some of her own dresses, treating her almost like a daughter. But Elizabeth became increasingly unstable, making wild accusations about my behavior, claiming I'd done things that no gentleman would ever consider." Wade listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When Harrison described the night of the alleged assault, his account painted Lark as a woman who'd flown into an unprovoked rage when confronted about missing household money. "She attacked me without warning," Harrison concluded, touching the faint scar on his forehead. "If my wife hadn't arrived when she did, I might have been killed." "I see." Wade set down his pen and studied Harrison's face. "And after this attack, what did you do?" "I was unconscious for several minutes. When I came to, Elizabeth was gone, along with $43 from the household safe." "You didn't pursue her immediately?" "I was injured, Marshal. I needed medical attention. By the time I was well enough to act, she'd disappeared." Wade nodded and turned to Lark. "Mrs. Hart, you've heard Mr. Harrison's account. What's your version of these events?" Lark took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of this moment. Everything they'd built together, everything they hoped for the future, hung on her ability to make this man understand the truth. "Marshal Wade," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I was hired by the Harrison family to serve as governess to their 2 children. The position was advertised as including room, board, and $7 monthly wages. For the first month, everything seemed normal." She described the gradual erosion of boundaries, the late-night visits that began as supposedly innocent checks on her welfare and escalated into something far more sinister. She spoke of wages withheld for invented infractions, of isolation from other servants, of a deliberate campaign to make her dependent and vulnerable. "He told me that my employment was conditional," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "That if I wanted to keep my position, if I wanted my wages, I needed to show proper gratitude for his family's generosity." "You're saying Mr. Harrison demanded sexual favors in exchange for employment?" "I'm saying he made it clear that my refusal would result in immediate dismissal without pay or references. In St. Louis in winter, for a woman with no family and no resources, that would have meant destitution." Harrison's face had gone red again. "Marshal, this is exactly the kind of wild fantasy I warned you about. She's a disturbed woman who—" "Mr. Harrison," Wade said sharply, "you'll have your chance to respond. Let the lady finish." Lark described the night everything came to a head. Harrison had been drinking heavily, she said, and had cornered her in the kitchen pantry where she'd gone to prepare the children's bedtime snacks. "He tore my dress," she said simply. "Said he was tired of my reluctance, that it was time I paid my debt to the family properly. When I tried to push him away, he became violent. I reached for the first thing I could find to defend myself. The skillet. Yes, I hit him once, hard enough to make him let go of me. He fell and struck his head on the pantry shelf. When Mrs. Harrison found us, I was still holding the skillet, and he was unconscious on the floor. And then Mrs. Harrison began screaming at me, calling me names, threatening to have me arrested for attempted murder. She said no one would believe the word of a servant against her husband. She said they'd make sure I was charged with assault and theft regardless of the truth." Lark's voice grew stronger as she continued. "So I took the 6 months of wages they owed me from the household money, packed what I could carry, and left that night. Wade made more notes, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Hart, do you have any proof of these wage payments? Any documentation? Mr. Harrison never provided written wage statements. He said it wasn't necessary for household staff. Convenient, Wade murmured. Mr. Harrison, is it your practice to avoid providing wage documentation to your employees? It's not required by law, and most domestic help prefer to be paid in cash without records that might support their claims if disputes arise. Harrison's lawyer-trained mind recognized the trap he'd walked into. Marshal, I resent the implication that I'm not implying anything. I'm asking direct questions about your employment practices. Wade consulted his notes again. Now, about these witnesses you mentioned. Your wife, presumably? Yes, and several friends who can attest to Elizabeth's increasingly erratic behavior. I see. And what about the other servants in your household? The cook and housemaid, Mrs. Hart mentioned? For the first time, Harrison looked genuinely uncomfortable. They were dismissed shortly after this incident. Their services were no longer needed. How convenient. So the only witnesses to the events in question are you, your wife, and Mrs. Hart herself. Wade stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street while he processed what he'd heard. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and Harrison's increasingly agitated breathing. Marshal, Sheriff Cole spoke up from his position near the door. If I may add something to this discussion? Go ahead, Sheriff. I've known Jed Hart for 7 years. He's as honest a man as I've ever met. If he says his wife is telling the truth, that carries weight with me. And I've known Mrs. Hart for several weeks now, added a new voice from the doorway. Father Miguel stepped into the office, his presence immediately commanding respect. I performed their marriage ceremony, and I've spent considerable time with both of them. Mrs. Hart is a woman of exceptional character and deep faith. The idea that she would fabricate such serious accusations is preposterous. Harrison whirled around. You don't know her. You've only seen what she wants you to see. And you, Mr. Harrison, Father Miguel replied with quiet authority, what do you want us to see? A man of God learns to recognize truth and to recognize those who would twist it for their own purposes. Wade returned to his desk and picked up another document. Mr. Harrison, I took the liberty of sending telegrams to several law enforcement agencies in Missouri. It seems this isn't the first time allegations of this nature have been raised regarding your household. Harrison went very still. What are you talking about? 2 other former employees made similar claims in the past 3 years. Both cases were dismissed due to lack of evidence and the women's inability to afford legal representation. Those were false accusations made by disgruntled servants seeking 3 women. Mr. Harrison, 3 separate incidents, all following the same pattern. Employment under false pretenses, wages withheld, sexual coercion, and ultimately accusations of theft when they tried to leave. Wade's voice was deadly quiet. That's either the most remarkable coincidence in legal history, or it's a pattern of predatory behavior. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison's face had gone ashen, and for the first time since his arrival, he seemed to understand that his wealth and influence might not be enough to protect him here. Furthermore, Wade continued, I've received a very interesting telegram from a Detective Morrison in St. Louis, no relation to Mrs. Hart, apparently. It seems Mrs. Harrison filed for divorce 2 days ago, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting a restraining order against her husband. Jed felt Lark's hand tighten as hope bloomed in his chest. Wade wasn't just investigating the charges against Lark. He was building a case against Harrison himself. Now then, the marshal said, settling back in his chair, let's discuss. What happens next? Mr. Harrison, based on what I've heard today and the information I've gathered from Missouri, I have serious doubts about the validity of your accusations against Mrs. Hart. Marshal, you can't just... However, Wade continued, overriding Harrison's protest, I do have significant concerns about a pattern of behavior that suggests violations of federal law regarding the transportation of women across state lines for immoral purposes. Harrison's face went white. You can't prove anything. Maybe not, but I can certainly investigate. and I can make sure that any future complaints about your treatment of female employees receive very careful attention from federal authorities." Wade stood and addressed the room formally. "Based on my investigation, I find insufficient evidence to support the charges of theft and assault against Mrs. Elizabeth Hart. The matter is closed from a federal perspective." Lark sagged against Jet's shoulder, tears of relief streaming down her face. They'd won. Somehow, impossibly, truth had prevailed over money and influence. "However," Wade added, turning to Harrison, "I strongly advise you to return to St. Louis immediately and address the legal difficulties awaiting you there. And Mr. Harrison, if I hear of you bothering Mr. and Mrs. Hart again, for any reason, I'll consider it harassment and act accordingly." As Harrison and his expensive lawyer left the sheriff's office in defeat, Jed wrapped his arms around his wife and held her close. They'd faced the worst their enemies could throw at them and emerged not just victorious, but stronger than ever. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "We're free." "We're free," she repeated, marveling at the words. For the first time in months, the future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility rather than shadowed by fear. They were going home, together. 6 months later, the high desert of New Mexico bloomed with the kind of spring that makes men remember why they chose to call hard country home. The canyon walls painted themselves in shades of red and gold as the morning sun climbed toward its zenith, and wildflowers dotted the rangeland like scattered jewels. From the porch of their cabin, Jed Hart watched his wife hang laundry on the line, marveling at how completely she'd transformed not just his life, but his understanding of what life could be. Lark moved with the easy confidence of a woman who belonged exactly where she was. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes during those first desperate weeks had been replaced by something that could only be called contentment. She hummed as she worked, always humming now, filling their home with melodies that seemed to rise naturally from a heart at peace. "Mrs. Hart," he called from his position on the porch steps, where he was mending a bridle while Rex dozed in the sun, "you're looking particularly beautiful this morning." She turned to smile at him, her face bright with the kind of joy that made ordinary moments feel precious. "Mr. Hart, you say that every morning, and I mean it every morning." The playful exchange was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Jed tensed reflexively, old habits from their time of troubles died hard but relaxed when he recognized Sheriff Cole's distinctive bay gelding. The lawman rode with purpose, but without urgency, suggesting news rather than emergency. "Morning, Ben," Jed called as the sheriff dismounted. "Coffee's still warm if you're interested." "Wouldn't say no to a cup," Cole replied, tying his horse to the porch rail. "Got some news I thought you'd want to hear." They settled on the porch with their coffee, while Lark joined them, drying her hands on her apron. Over the months since their confrontation with Harrison, Cole had become not just an ally, but a genuine friend, someone who appreciated the quiet strength of their partnership and the way they'd built something beautiful from desperate circumstances. "Heard from Marshal Wade yesterday," Cole began, savoring his first sip of Lark's expertly brewed coffee. "Thought you'd be interested to know that Charles Harrison won't be bothering anyone else." "What happened?" Lark asked, settling beside Jed on the porch swing he'd built for her birthday last month. Turns out the divorce wasn't the end of his troubles. 2 more women came forward after news of the investigation got out. Women who'd worked for him years ago and had been too afraid to speak up. With their testimony and the evidence Wade gathered, the district attorney in St. Louis filed formal charges. Cole paused to take another sip of coffee, clearly enjoying the dramatic tension of his news. Harrison's been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for violation of the Mann Act, transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. Seems he'd been using his shipping business to bring in vulnerable women from other states, specifically to exploit them. Jed felt Lark's hand slip into his, her fingers intertwining with his own. They'd known this day might come, but hearing it confirmed brought a sense of closure neither had dared to hope for. "And the money?" Lark asked quietly. "Full restitution ordered for all the women he cheated out of wages, plus damages. You'll be receiving a bank draft for $215, 6 months' wages plus interest and compensation for your suffering." $215 was more money than Jed had ever seen at one time. It represented security, opportunity, the chance to expand their small ranch, or perhaps start the family they'd begun talking about on long winter evenings by the fire. "There's more," Cole continued. "Mrs. Harrison, she's Mrs. Catherine Morrison now, took back her maiden name, wanted me to pass along a message. She's established a fund to help women in similar situations, and she wanted you to know that your courage in speaking up made the difference. Said you saved other women from suffering what you suffered." Lark was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what Cole had told them. Justice had not only been served, it had been served in a way that would protect others from experiencing the hell she'd endured. "I'm glad," she said finally. "Not glad that he's in prison. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, but glad that he can't hurt anyone else." After Cole left, they walked their property as they did most evenings, checking on the cattle that had multiplied from Yet's original 30 head to nearly 50. The extra pasture they'd been able to lease with money Lark had earned by taking in sewing from the other ranch wives was dotted with spring calves, their playful antics bringing laughter from both humans and providing endless entertainment for Rex. "Hard to believe it's only been 8 months since that storm," Jed mused as they paused by the creek where they'd first met. The water ran higher now with snow from the mountains, and wildflowers grew thick along its banks. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime," Lark replied. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday." They'd established new traditions in their married life, rituals that marked their transition from desperate survival to confident partnership. Every evening they shared their thoughts about the day, their hopes for tomorrow, their dreams for the future they were building together. Every Sunday after church in Socorro, they visited the small cemetery where Father Miguel had helped them place a stone, marker for Yet's fallen comrades, a ritual that had helped him finally find peace with his wartime ghosts. "Lark," Jed said, as they turned back toward the cabin, its windows glowing golden in the sunset, "do you ever regret it? The way things happened, how fast we had to move." She stopped walking and turned to face him fully, her hands reaching up to frame his face. In the years since their marriage, the lines around his eyes had softened, the permanent tension in his shoulders had eased, and something vital had returned to his expression that she suspected had been missing since the war. "Jedediah Hart," she said with mock seriousness, "are you asking me if I regret marrying the most wonderful man in New Mexico territory? I'm asking if you regret not having the courtship you deserved, the fancy wedding, the time to be sure." She kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of all the love that had grown between them like desert flowers after rain unexpected, resilient and more beautiful for having bloomed in harsh conditions. "I had exactly the courtship I needed," she said against his lips. 2 weeks of you showing me every day through your actions that I was safe, valued, and cherished. Do you know how many women get years of pretty words, but never experience that kind of genuine care?" As they reached their cabin truly theirs now, expanded with a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen where Lark taught Jed to cook dishes his mother would have been proud of, Rex bounded ahead to claim his evening position. By the fireplace dot inside, Lark lit the lamps while Jed built up the fire against the desert's evening chill. The cabin had become a sanctuary filled with evidence of their shared life, books they read aloud to each other, quilts Lark had sewn during the long winter afternoons, furniture Jed had crafted with increasing skill and confidence. On the mantelpiece, in a place of honor, sat a small framed photograph taken by the traveling photographer who'd passed through Socorro in March. It showed them standing together in their best clothes, Yet's hand on Lark's shoulder, both of them smiling with the quiet satisfaction of people who'd found exactly where they belonged. "I have something to tell you," Lark said as they settled by the fire with their evening coffee, a ritual that had become as essential as breathing. Something in her tone made Jed look up sharply from the piece of wood he'd been whittling into. "A toy horse for the preacher's youngest son. Good news or concerning news? That depends on how you feel about expanding our family." The words hit him like a lightning bolt of pure joy. He set down his carving and stared at her, afraid to hope, afraid to assume what she might mean. "Lark, are you saying—" "I'm saying that come October, Rex is going to have to share his position." as the most spoiled member of this household. Her smile was radiant, transforming her face with a glow that had nothing to do with the firelight. Jed crossed to her in 2 quick strides, lifting her from her chair and spinning her around the small cabin while she laughed with delight. When he set her down, both of them were crying and laughing simultaneously. "A baby," he whispered, as if saying it too loudly might break the spell. "We are having a baby." "We're having a baby," she confirmed. "And before you start worrying about whether we're ready or whether we can afford it or whether you'll be a good father, let me tell you something. Any child lucky enough to be raised by you will have the most patient, protective, loving papa in the territory." That night, as they lay in their bed with Lark's head on Yet's shoulder and his hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach, they talked about names and nurseries and all the ways their already perfect life was about to become even more remarkable. "What do you think your mother would say?" Lark asked sleepily. "About us, about the baby, about the way things turned out?" Jed was quiet for a moment, thinking about the woman who'd raised him to believe in second chances and the power of kindness, to heal old wounds. "I think she'd say that love stories don't always start with meeting across a crowded ballroom. Sometimes they start with finding someone half frozen by a creek and deciding to choose compassion over caution. And I think she'd say that families aren't always born," Lark added. "Sometimes they're made by people brave enough to trust their hearts even when their heads tell them it's foolish." Outside their window, the desert night settled over the land with the promise of another tomorrow, another chance to build on the foundation they'd laid together. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl answered with its own ancient song of partnership and persistence. Inside the cabin, Mr. and Mrs. Hart held each other close and marveled at the simple miracle of finding exactly what they needed in the last place they'd expected to look. They'd learned that the best love stories weren't about perfect people finding perfect circumstances, but about imperfect people choosing to make something beautiful from whatever broken pieces life handed them. Rex stretched in his sleep by the dying fire, probably dreaming of chasing rabbits through endless sagebrush. On the mantelpiece, their wedding photograph caught the last glimmers of firelight, preserving forever the moment when 2 lonely souls had decided to stop being lonely together. And in the growing darkness, warmed by love and hope and the unshakable knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged, the Hart family, soon to be 3 instead of 2, settled into the peaceful sleep of people who'd found their way home at last.